Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this morning's Qdabra software webinar. I hope everybody can hear me okay. I think I've actually managed to unmute my mics. This is Hilary Stoupa, and I am a developer for Qdabra software and also an InfoPath MVP. I am recording this session, so we'll have this for later if there's anything here you want to see again. This is probably not going to be terribly long or complex, but we're going to discuss something that's kind of near and dear to my heart, and that's leveraging secondary data sources for logic. So hopefully there's something here for everybody. Moving along, let me see if I can figure out how to use PowerPoint. It's always a guessing game with me to see if I can work out these things. So this is just a little slide showing, what we do, what we offer. We've got different tools and templates. We can help you build things. We can advise you on your decisions, your design decisions, your architecture decisions. And we stay pretty on top of the InfoPath Dev Forum, which may be where some of you have found us. So at any rate, we're here for you and willing to give you a hand with your InfoPath and SharePoint projects. So dive right in. What am I talking about? We can use in our InfoPath Forms XML secondary data sources. And you've maybe created a connection to an XML file you have somewhere. I think commonly this gets used to connect to another XML file, maybe in another library that you used InfoPath to create, right? And so you can have a URL to an XML file. The other thing, though, that I think I don't see as often is we can create our own XML files. We can add them to our form as a resource and create a data connection to those, and then we can leverage these XML files for different things. Now, the nice thing about a secondary data source like this is you have a lot of flexibility. If you need a node for something, you add it to your XML and you refresh your data connection. Bingo, there you've got it. You don't have to worry about cluttering up your main data source with helper fields. I have seen a lot of bad data sources in my time, and a lot of times it's because there's things that are added to them that are unnecessary. Your main data source, it describes what your form is saving. It describes what your form needs. In general, our kind of Qdabra philosophy is that you should only put data in there that you need to save, right? Because when you save your filled out form, the saved XML file has the data in it that you're saving, and so you only want to save the data you actually need to have persist, the stuff that you need in order to have this XML make sense. But if you've got things like a help section that you're showing and hiding, it's probably more appropriate to have that in a secondary data source, right? Because this isn't persistent information, whether or not the user showed the help section. You probably just want to go ahead and have that hidden every time they open the form. Or whether or not, which tab they have selected. That's probably something you want to default to a particular tab every time they open the form. So there's certain things of this nature that we just don't want in our main data source. One of the things I love about XML is that it's self-describing, or it should be. In a good world, in a perfect world, our XML is self-describing, right? Because when we look at an XML file in something like Notepad, it's nice to be able to actually just read through it and say, oh, I know that this date here is the date that the request was submitted because the field name is request submitted date. There's a human readability factor here when XML is done right. And when we go and we look at an XML and it's all cluttered up with a bunch of view state information or helper fields for logic, it gets a little icky. At the same point in time, we don't want to put ourselves through a great deal of contortions to try to keep that main data source clean. And a lot of times I'll see people reuse a field when maybe they shouldn't, or trying to get by with fewer fields when more would make the logic easier. So a secondary data source like this can definitely help with that sort of a thing. It simplifies form logic reuse, and what I mean by that is not necessarily from one form to the next, although having good design patterns will help you when you move from one form to the next. Consistency is going to always be your friend when you go from one form to the next. But what I mean is within the form itself, let's say you have 5 views and each view has a submit button, and that submit button takes the same actions in each view. And the first time you set it up, when you were first designing the form, it was no big deal because you probably just copied and pasted that button to each view. But now you're debugging the form and you're trying to figure out what's wrong, and you make a change to the submit button in one view, but not in the other 4 views, right? You change the rule set in one place, and now you're baffled because your submit isn't behaving consistently, because if you're at all like me, you've sort of forgotten you have 4 other views and that all of those buttons need to be updated too. So I'm going to show you a technique that'll help you with that. This lets you kind of add some programming style best practices to your rules in order to kind of have like the the try-catch paradigm in place where you try something, you figure out if there's an error, you handle for the error. With InfoPath, this isn't perfect because sometimes InfoPath just pops up an error and stops running our rules, but we can at least make sure the user doesn't get stuck. I'll show you that. Allowing you to modify a rule set one time, one location, well, that was this 5 views, 5 submit buttons thing I was just talking about. It also, if you are not the only designer working on your form, it's going to help you pass a form between designers. At Qdabra, we've got a lot of different form designers. A lot of people might work on a form, and a form might get passed around. You know it's hard to have 2 people work on the same form at the same time, but that doesn't mean it's not going to get tossed from one person to the other. Especially around here, we might have one person do a lot of the basic design, and then they get to a point maybe where they've sort of maxed out what their knowledge or skill set will accomplish, and they'll hand it off to somebody else who is able then to complete maybe the more complex logic in the form. By having some standardization, it becomes easier for us to hand these forms around because we all kind of use this same pattern, and we sort of know where to look for the logic. And of course, future you is going to be so happy when you've had this form in production for 3 years and it's been trucking along, and now there's a new head of research and development and he'd like a form change, and you haven't looked at this thing in design mode in those 3 years, and you're sitting there going, I wonder what I did that for. And so kind of consolidating this logic can make it easier for you to find things. So that's our why. The how, we just create a secondary XML file. There's some free tools that can help you write XML a little more easily. We'll look at Notepad++ because it's my favorite. You add the file as a resource and you create a data connection to it. I'm picky about how this gets done, so I'm going to show you my favorite way and why it makes me fussy when people do it in a different way. Maybe it's just because I'm fussy. And we're going to talk about using these secondary data source fields to consolidate logic, save that view state info that should not be persisted, get rid of the clutter, and we're going to add stop and reset actions, which we tend to use on pretty much all of our action rule sets, because then if something goes wrong, your user doesn't get stuck. And I've even got a nice broken demo that I can show you the process of getting stuck. So as always, there's some gotchas. Sometimes with repeating data in the main data source, you just need to have a helper field inside the repeating group. Maybe you have something that needs to be refreshed or reset, and you need that action to fire on every single instance of the repeating group. An easy way to do that is to add a helper field inside the repeating group that's a true-false, and then you use an action outside of the repeating group to set all of them to true. They go do their business, and then they set themselves back to false. So there are places where a helper field, especially in repeating data, it makes sense to have it there. There's some workarounds. They get kind of complex, and most of them require a little code or key rules, and it's just, if you want to use pure rule-based logic, go ahead and just add that field. In your secondary data source, in your XML file, whatever you set the value of the field to, if you give it any value at all, that's what it's going to be every single time the form is opened. You're not going to be able to change that value. So that's wonderful if you always want the help section to hide. It's not so wonderful if there's information that you need the next time the form is opened and it's not easy for you to get. So you just need to be aware of that and preview with an existing XML to kind of get, fill out an XML preview with existing and get a sense of what's going to happen when you open up an already filled out form. Does something change? Drag that secondary data source onto your canvas and take a look at what's going on. So it's just be aware that things are going to be whatever they were in your secondary data source when the form is reopened. And finally, and I'm guilty of this, and so are some of my colleagues, where we get so in this mindset that we can't junk up our main data source, purity above all, blah, blah, that we go to these extreme contortions to use our form logic. And if you find yourself writing 10 rules where one would do if you had something in your main data source, persist the information, just save it. One thing I can think of offhand is when you first open a browser form before you fill it out, there's certain URL parameters that'll tell you where it's opened from, which is helpful if it's a browser form or a content type. A browser form, that's a content type. And you can get that information again when you reopen a filled out XML, but the same parameter is not in the URL. And we've gone to some extraordinary lengths to try to get that again, when it was really much simpler just to add a field to the main data source that's, form library, and populate that when we first open it, and just persist the data, So yeah, be careful. If you're going through contortions, just say to yourself, okay, I'm going to store this in the main data source. But I'm just saying, make a decision about it, right? Don't let it just happen. Don't assume that every little piece of whatever you need in your form needs to go in your main data source. So here's my list of demos. I'm, of course, going to completely ignore this now and show you stuff probably in a different order. Whoops, and let me continue to change slides randomly. Let me see if I can find my... see if I can find my folder system. I'm going to pause the slideshow. Maybe that will help me. Nope. Sorry, guys. I'm going to end the slideshow because I'm just kind of bad at PowerPoint. So here we go. I'll go ahead and pop over to my demos. Now, the first one I want to show you is, I've talked about why we want things in one location and how it can help us. So, I'm using one of our internal forms to show you this, and that's because we just did this the other day. A colleague and I just went through this form. We made some changes, and it's recently been put into production. And we have, in different views, we have this suggestion area. And so we generally, and it submits to another form, and what it does is it's kind of like a little bug tracker. So any internal form you use, you should be able to submit a suggestion, and that should go to whoever's currently, the form owner, so that they say, oh, hey, so-and-so suggested this for the customer contact form. I'm going to implement it. So you sort of want that suggestion to always go, to the same person. So if we look at our different views, we've got quite a few different views. And what we had done is we had gone to the submit suggestion in one view, and let's click on Manage Rules, and we had changed the rule actions where we're setting the values for who it gets assigned to. And we had changed this to be Bree, who's the form designer right now and owns this form, and we wanted all these suggestions to go to her. And yet, at the same point in time, suggestions were still getting submitted to other people, And of course, it was because we have these same rules on the Submit Suggestion button here. And here they're submitting suggestions to somebody else. And possibly in a different view, we might have had another person, if we had changed it there but not changed it here. So we have this same rule set on this button, which when we first designed the form, no big deal. We copied the button, we pasted it in the different views. It just wasn't an issue. But now that we are wanting to make edits, all of a sudden our maintenance just went up. We have to remember to either copy and paste our button with the corrected rules into every single view, or we have to go change our rules in every single view. And there is a better way. And so in this, let me find the right one. In this copy of the form, what I did was I took a different approach. And so if we look at the rules here on the Submit Suggestion button, all this is doing is it's setting a field's value to 1. It's setting a field called Submit Suggestion to 1. And in every single view, I have that same rule. So again, when you first set up the form, you could use copy-paste. You could set up your button, Submit Suggestion. It sets this one field to 1, and then you just paste that into every single view. No big deal. Now when you need to change your rules, here's where your rules change. They don't change on each button. Instead, they change here in our View Logic file. And in our View Logic file, we have here a folder called Triggers. And in the triggers, we have a field called Submit Suggestion. So what's going to happen? Submit Suggestion is going to get set to 1. If I've set things up right, that's going to change the value on this field, and it's going to fire some actions. So set values, submit, assign, and clear values. These were the rules that were on my original field. Okay, so these are just the same. And so now if I want to change who this is assigned to, I can change it just in one place, right? If I want to change how it's submitting or assigning, or if I don't want to clear these values, or if I want to reset them differently, it's all in one place. It's just on this one field. Now, what we've done here is, here's the piece I was talking about where we're kind of implementing kind of a programming style logic. The first rule on this field is to stop. And that's if Submit Suggestion is not equal to 1. So when this form gets reset to 0 or reset to blank, or somebody somewhere sets it to what time is it, or anything other than 1, we stop running rules. So we just stop running rules if it's not equal to 1. Now our button sets it to 1. So this first rule is not going to run. Make sure you notice this. We've got it set to not run remaining rules if the condition is met. And we're saying set a field's value. And we're setting the field of stop to blank. And we generally add this little attribute called stop just for the purpose of setting it to blank. Because in InfoPath, I want to say it's 2010 and forward, it used to be we could have a rule that didn't have any actions as long as we had this checkbox marked, but as of I think 2010, InfoPath no longer allows that. So we just usually add a little attribute that we set to blank and it doesn't do anything. Okay, so this is my stop rule. It always comes first. My second rule that I always have is reset self. And what that does is that sets this field back to blank. Now, the reason we do that is because we want to make sure that the next time I click Submit Suggestion, it changes the value of this field to 1. And this field can't already be 1 because, as we all know, rules only fire when a field's value changes. So if we leave this field at value 1, the next time your user clicks the button, they won't get anywhere. Okay? So the first thing we do is we check, is it the value I anticipate? If it's not, just don't do anything. The second thing we do is we say, okay, we know that if it was not 1, it would have stopped here. Therefore, the next thing we're going to do is we're going to clear the field. Now this field is all ready to go for the next time we click the button. To top it all off, if any of these things go wrong and fail, and InfoPath gets angry, and it pops up one of those messages that says, hey, I couldn't figure out what to do with your rules, so I just stopped. I hope that's okay, ma'am. So when InfoPath does that to you, it's kind of okay because our field is back to blank, which means the next time we click the button, it's going to try to execute the rules again. So it can help you get over a hiccup like, my user was not smart enough to connect to the network before using their form, or anything of those lines. And I'm going to show you, I've got a little sample. So hopefully this kind of shows you, this is kind of a real life, here's the benefit right here. I mean, we had a form where we changed the rules in 5 places, or had to copy and paste the button into 5 different spots. And now we have a form where we can change this logic without changing the button at all. So we've got this nice kind of separation between our logic and our control in a way, because we know all of our logic is here. And as somebody who's maybe going to pick the form up and do some work after the original designer, I know, oh, view logic, great. I see this data source that says view logic, and I know already it's got logic in it, and I can go look at these different fields and get a sense for what things are happening in the form. I can, then use the rule inspector to see what might be setting, what might be setting that field, right? And this gives me a sense, if I go look down, rules that may change this field or group. Oh, the button submit suggestion, that one changes it. Okay? So hopefully that's convinced you of the value of this particular approach. And now we're going to look at a couple, quickly, because I always go over, you guys know that by now. We're going to look at a couple little samples. So this is my first sample, and I'll send you the sample. It's just a real straightforward one. It's nice and simple. Here's my form logic as a data connection. Let's look at the XML. I've got a little, this is kind of a little starter XML where I've got a view folder and an actions group and a flags group. I use Notepad++. I make sure my language is set to XML. You can do that by saving your file as XML, or if it doesn't recognize it's XML, you go to XML. Notepad++ is an excellent tool. I use the plugin, the XML Tools plugin, so you want to make sure you add that. And if you've got these things, it will do helpful things for you, like add closing tags, okay? Or if you, make a mistake, right, you can see right away that you've kind of got a mistake, and if you do Control-Alt-Shift-B to pretty print it, it at least tells you that you've got errors in your content. So the color highlighting can be very helpful. It will help you with your XML in general. So if you're not super comfortable writing XML by hand, this is a great tool to help you along. So I really highly recommend it. So here's the form logic I'm using right now in my sample. And you can see I've got some tabs and a selected tab name. I've got a help field for my help section. I've got my stop attribute. I've got a submit field. I've got here a little flag as to whether or not it's valid, and I'm starting out with it at 0. I've actually got some drop-down options here that I added because I wanted some drop-downs in my secondary data source, and it's just easier to use. It's easier to use a secondary data source for those drop-down options if the drop-down is bound to a secondary data source field, because InfoPath is very obnoxious about letting you use hard-coded values for that. It'll not select a default, it won't let you select a default, and it will complain that it has no default. So all in all, it's a bad experience. So here's my validation drop-down options. So these are the fields I'm using in my form logic. Now, generally speaking, when I create a data connection to a form logic or a resource file like this, I go to resource files first and I add it here. Okay, and then I manage my data connection, or I create the new data connection, and when I walk through, I select it from the resource files. Now you can also, when you go to modify your data connection, you can go to resource files, click add, and then you find your, let me find my folder here, you find your form logic that you want. Right, you say OK, and it should, usually it asks if I want to overwrite. There we go. It asks if I want to overwrite it, and I go ahead and I say, yeah, I want to replace the existing file. Now, the reason I do it this way, let me go ahead and get through here. The reason I do it this way, I will show you back in this form. When I was looking at this form earlier, I found something that was a little problematic for me, because I needed to see what the values were in the view logic file. I needed to know which XML, I needed to know which XML was being used for the view logic file, because I needed to export it so I could make a change to it. I needed to add a field to it. But look, I've got view logic and I've got view logic 1. So I can't tell just looking at the resource file which one is being used, sales probability 1. Right? And I have to go look at the data connection now, go find it, view logic, and now I can see, oh, it's using view logic 1. That's because if you just walk through the data source connection, and I'm going to go ahead and show you this in my broken one because I don't want to mess up my nice one. If you just walk through it here and you go modify and browse, and here's form logic and next, and yeah, include it and finish. Okay, so now you can see it's using form logic, not formlogic.xml. Let's go look at our resource files. Oh, look, it added it again. Let's walk through the data connection one more time. And if you're making a lot of changes and you're walking through this data connection a lot, right, browse, oh, I updated this, let's add the new one, right, and you're doing this a lot, eventually you get to the point where your resource files has, you know, form logic 15, form logic 16. It's just unnecessary. It's a lot of overhead. If instead you make sure your resource file is up to date and has the same name, and then you update the data connection using that same resource file, you do not run into this problem. So I highly encourage you to do it that way. And that was the thing I mentioned that I'm a little fussy about. You can probably guess I'm fussy about a lot of things. But at any rate, so when I need to change this resource file, what I do is I export first, I make my changes, I use add, and then if I change the schema, I'll walk through the data connection wizard again. If I just change the value of something, let's say I want the default of valid to be 1 instead of 0, I would just update the XML and the resource files. There's absolutely no reason to walk through manage data connections, modify the data connection, and walk through that. The only time we have to do that is if we add fields or modify the schema. So as long as you're not changing the schema, if you're just messing around and changing default values, all you have to do is update the resource file. When we walk through a data connection in the data connection wizard, what InfoPath is doing is it's generating this schema. Right? And so there's absolutely, for a data change, there's no need to walk through it again. So finally, let me just kind of show you what I've got going on here. I've got some different tabs. These tabs are using the local name of these different fields to get their name. So if we take a look here at the button properties, you can see I'm using the local name, and I'm just using my different tab fields to give me my tab names in kind of a simple way so I don't have a bunch of text in my rule logic. When we go and look at our conditions here, manage rules, oh, InfoPath, why have you made this so hard? There we go. If we go look at my hide rule, you know it's selected tab name is not equal to local name. If we look at setting things to selected, you know it's selected if the local tab name is general. When we set it, we set the tab name to the local name of general. So I'm using the local name. I tend to find that simpler. Other people have different preferences. I have a help section here. It's hiding if help is not equal to 1, which means no matter what I set it to, no matter how many times I look at help, every time I reopen the form, it's going to be hidden. But now you know, and I know, that if for some reason, let's say my users have a really hard time remembering to click the help button, we could always say, well, help is 1 is our default. So if you wanted help to always show when you open the form, you could change that here. If you wanted the general tab, we're going to do this in just a second. If you wanted the general tab to always show in the form, when the form is open, you could do that here. You could say, well, our selected tab name is general, and then that would always show. I'm going to save these changes. We're going to preview as is, and then we'll update the form logic and look at the differences. So if we preview this, nothing is selected to begin with. We show help, we hide help, we can click our different tabs, they take us to our different views. In my submit section, I have rules on my submit that do a little bit of just kind of basic sort of this is how error handling can look. Let me show you in the actions. So here's my submit. I do stop, always, reset self, always. I'm saying if valid is equal to 1, then I'm saying it's succeeded. If value is not equal to 1, I'm saying it's failed. Obviously, in a real form, you would actually submit and then check something to see if you failed or succeeded. But this is just to kind of give you an idea of some error handling that you can have there. So if I say, well, it's not valid, and I click my button, you know, I get my error. If I say it's valid and I click my button, I don't have my error. So this is kind of how this thing looks right now. If I update my form logic, and I'm going to go ahead and export this because I'm going to want to throw it back in at a later date. I don't want to send you guys this with the oh, you know, this one that I just changed. Okay, and I'm going to replace the file and say OK, and then when I preview it, what should happen? Well, we had set help to 1, so help should show. We set the selected tab name to general, so general tab should be selected. And it looks like the default should be valid now on our submit section. So if we preview this guy, general tab is selected, help shows, clicking the button hides help, details submit, and we're set to valid. So that just kind of gives you a little idea of you know, how you can leverage this to change form behavior. Okay, so finally, last but not least, and then we've got time for questions, I am going to show you my broken sample. So in this sample form, what I've done is I've got a submit button, like the other one. My submit button, if we look at manage rules, if we ever find manage rules, is setting submit field to 1. You and I know that that's over here in form logic, action, submit. When submit is set to 1, the first thing we do is we stop if it's not equal to 1. Now it's hard to see because it's really not very dark, but I've disabled the reset self rule. Okay, so that's disabled. And now I've got something set up that's going to fail. Okay, because it's querying for a data connection that I can't connect to right now because I am not VPN'd in. So I'm going to go ahead and call this valid. I'm going to click the, whoops, sorry, not valid, it should fail. I'm going to click the pretend submit button, and it's going to take, oh, I forgot, it didn't reset. Let's try again. My failure is even failing. So not valid. I'm going to click the button. It's going to try to make its data connection. And what's going to happen is it's going to fail because it can't connect to the data. And because we're not resetting, if I click the button again, it's not even going to try. Okay, so that's kind of what I'm getting to here, is we'll fail and then it won't even try to run the report, try to run the rules again because, okay, so there's our failure. We know this. I'm going to tell it yes. Okay. Okay, here's what I was talking about. Some rules were not applied, operation aborted. So it's not going to apply the rest of my rules. Now, I can change things around as much as I want and click this button as much as I want, but nothing's ever going to happen again because my submit field here is still equal to 1 because I didn't reset it to blank. So it's not changing and it's not running the rules again. Okay, so that's why we reset it, and that's why we reset it very early, because this way, if we're going to do this one more time, if we preview not valid, now I've already got that set up, so it's going to fail, right? It's going to try to make its data connection. Hopefully the data connection will fail a little faster this time. And there we go. There's our failure. Yeah, sure. Go ahead. Okay. Operation aborted. Okay, so now it's not going to apply any more rules because it failed. However, if I change this to valid, it's not going to try to make that data connection, and my submit succeeds. So the point I'm trying to make here, and I'm concerned I'm not making it well, which is why I keep throwing more words at it. The point I'm trying to make here is that if we reset this to blank, we give the user an opportunity to not get stuck if things go wrong somewhere in here. We give the user the opportunity to try again. Now, yes, our rules were aborted. We didn't have an opportunity to really show them a meaningful message, but hopefully something that InfoPath popped up will stir them to some action, like InfoPath maybe popped up a validation message saying, well, we can't submit this because your form's in an invalid state, or like the message I got, we can't connect to this, you know, which would have made me think, oh, I'd better VPN in. And then I can click the button again, and I have a chance to succeed because my field that I'm using to trigger these actions has been reset, and clicking the button sets it to 1, so the actions fire again. So that's the importance of this kind of resetting. You just, if you always start with these two actions, a stop action and a reset self action, and then you add your other actions, you get more robust logic, and you get this ability to kind of give the user a chance to mess up and give the user a chance to self-correct. So hopefully, and I'm going to go ahead and go back to the slideshow maybe. Let's see what happens. Oh, good. Wrong screens. Let's swap them. So hopefully this was helpful. If you have any questions, feel free to type those in to the question window in the webinar. I'll send out the slides. We'll put together the slides and the video and the one little sample form so you can kind of check out how you know, how the different tabs worked and how I was leveraging form logic there, and then we can go from there. Oh, and I did have one other thing I was going to show you now that I think about it. I was going to show you a complicated form logic, and so I'll do that real quick. This, I'm going to hit Alt-0 and roll this up. This form logic is for a rather complex form, but you can see we still have very similar things going on. I've got a bunch of view stuff here. I've got a lot of tab stuff. I've got information on what types of requests would show a certain tab in the form. We've got information on you know, some search information where people can do some searching and so on. So that's just kind of a sample of one that's slightly more complex. We have a question about whether the view logic is for one field, and I'm afraid I don't really understand the question. I mean, we create an XML and it can have as many fields as you need in it for all the different actions. So if you have a submit action, you'd add it. You'd add a field for an assignment action, you'd add a field for searching, you know, whatever kind of logic your form needs. I find it helpful when I'm creating my view logic or my form logic XML. I find it helpful to sort of early on sit down and think about what are the actions I'm going to need in this form and add those. But the good news is it's very easy to edit the XML and walk through the data connection again and update if you're like, oh yeah, I needed to be able to search, or I needed to be able to do this or that. So hopefully that helps with the question. And let me continue to show you how I am incapable of using PowerPoint while I try to see the other questions here. There's a question, how can we submit to multiple SharePoint lists on different tabs? Well, you know, submit to multiple SharePoint lists on different tabs. Okay, so maybe you would have in your view logic, maybe you would have in your submit action field. Let's go look at one of these guys again. So maybe we've got submit, and maybe submit's going to have an attribute, list squid equals. Right, and so now your rule on your submit button would set the submit field and it would set the list squid, right? And yet all of your main submit actions would be here. So generally speaking, if there's additional information I need that would be from a specific view, I would add it as an attribute to the submit. Or if we think back to that internal form I showed you where it was assignment, maybe we wanted to assign to a different person based on the view. And so I might add an attribute like assign to, but then I would still have the bulk of my rules not needing to be changed, but in each view I would be passing in a little piece of additional information. That's a very good question. So yeah, you may have to, there may not be a universal rule set that covers every eventuality, but if you can make it as universal or reusable as possible from throughout the form and just pass in your necessary extra information like list squid and so on. And again, you know, list squid, you'll want to make sure at some point that it's getting set correctly, but since the rule actions aren't on it, it's not like you would have to reset it. Hopefully that made sense and was helpful. And updating resource files. And we've got a question that says, resource file updates, couldn't you just delete the old one and replace with the new one so you don't save multiples? Well, you certainly don't want to delete the old data connection and replace it with a new data connection because you'll lose your logic, right? So you don't want to do that. When you walk through the data connection wizard, if you click that browse button every single time and browse to your XML, InfoPath is going to create multiples as long as you're talking about a local file, right? If you're talking about, if you're saving your file, your XML file out on SharePoint or something like that, then you should be okay. But generally speaking, I like these as form resource files, so they're saved there. It really isn't. Once you kind of get in the habit of when you walk through that data connection, clicking either the resource files button or going to resource files first to update the XML, it really isn't a whole lot of extra steps, right, than clicking the browse button. And I just think it's so handy not to have multiples in terms of, you know, when somebody else goes to your form or when you go to your form and need to export that to make some changes. I think it's really useful to not have, you know, 14 or 15 copies of the same XML. And I see another question. Can we do it without hard coding the list squid? Rather use the list name? Yeah, sure. You know, you can use the list name, I believe, for the list web service. It's update list items. Yeah, and you can use the list name instead of a GUID. Absolutely. That web service accepts the list name, so that's not a problem. And then that way you don't have to be changing GUIDs around and so on. And that way when you move your form, it makes it a little easier too. So, well, I do not see any more questions. So hopefully if anybody has one, they'll pop up with it. Just a little note about our webinar kits. And then if you send us your feedback, we'll get you today's presentation and that little sample demo template so you can take a look at it. And I see, let me export. Yeah, Okay, and so great. Well, hopefully this was helpful, and I really encourage you to try to get your logic centralized and in one spot. I think you'll find it's easier to keep track of. I think you'll have a cleaner experience when it has to be updated, unless you guys are not like me and your forms turn out perfect the first time. And I hope everybody has a wonderful week and enjoy. I'll talk to you soon. Bye.